Just off Ronald Reagan Boulevard here in Forsyth County, just north of Atlanta, you've got these beautiful new homes that are going up all over the place. And behind them, in this subdivision, you've got what's left of the black community that was totally massacred and forced out of the county way back in late 1912. After this, for years, up until the 1980s and 1990s, the black community was not allowed in this county. The census of 1910 said there were about 1,100 black folks that lived in this county, and in 4 months, 98% of them left. Night riders were marauding through the countryside, throwing dynamite in churches, shooting people who refused to leave, and anybody that didn't pay their property taxes. And keep in mind, you couldn't come back for decades. Their homes were simply sold to the highest white bidders. I've come up to Forsyth County, Georgia today to talk a little bit about the 1912 race war that resulted in the total depopulation of all black residents. Now, the spark that lit the barrel was the rape and murder of 19-year-old May Crow, and make no mistake, May Crow was a victim in all of this. The daughter of a prominent white local family, she was raped and murdered, supposedly by 16-year-old Ernest Knox, but as the story continues, you will learn that a lot of facts about this case are up for debate. The official narrative of the start of the 1912 Forsyth County race war goes something like this. May Crow was walking along Browns Bridge Road, which led from the county seat of Cumming up to the black community of Oscarville, which is now inundated by Lake Lanier. There she encountered 16-year-old Ernest Knox, a local black boy. He approached her and began to assault her. When she fought back, he picked up a rock and crushed her skull. Realizing the severity of what he'd done, he dragged her into the woods and went back to Oscarville to get his brother-in-law, 17-year-old Oscar Daniel. Oscar realized how serious the situation was and got his sister Jane. Jane went and fetched her 24-year-old live-in boyfriend, Robert Edwards. They all came out to view the body, and a few of them touched May Crow to turn her over, leaving evidence after Ernest Knox accidentally dropped a comb that he had just bought in the community. And this was enough for locals to use to tie to Ernest Knox the following day when May Crow's body was found in the woods. Supposedly, those young black residents of Oscarville who viewed the body, they all discussed the possibility of disposing of Crow's body in the Chattahoochee, but eventually decided their safest option was simply to leave her here to be discovered by passerbys. Now, the sheriff immediately arrested Knox because he was the closest black person in proximity to the body, and it was only after that that the comb was found, which the sheriff brought to the general store and asked if he'd sold it to the boy recently. Of course, the owner of the general store said yes, because he knew he would likely be beaten or tortured if he said no. Then the sheriff tortured the 16-year-old Ernest Knox by holding him upside down over a well and forcing him to name names. Naturally, he named his 17-year-old brother-in-law, Oscar Daniel. The sheriff then got a name out of Oscar Daniel by probably doing the same thing, mock lynching, and naturally Oscar Daniel named the closest person to him, his father. Now the case was coming together, and the local community seemed to blame all of Oscarville for the crime. And this is about the point that the story seems to get a little bit unusual, and you can see that behind the scenes, people were working to turn this from a lynching into a full-scale race war. So 16-year-old Ernest Knox had been tortured by the sheriff in a mock lynching to name his stepbrother, Oscar Daniel, and the police went to their mother, who admitted that the boys had been at the scene of the crime and begged the police to have mercy. Both of these boys were kept at the jail in Hall County, where a mob had begun to amass, and they were spirited away under cover of darkness to a jail in Atlanta where they could be better protected. But local cops felt they needed a bit of a sacrificial lamb, so they went over to the home of Daniel's sister and began to speak to her. Well, they took her under arrest, essentially for interrogation, but it was an arrest, and took down the name of her live-in boyfriend, Rob Edwards. Now, because the other boys were in Atlanta and the locals were demanding blood, they arrested Big Rob Edwards and brought him to the local jail, which was much less protected than the one in Atlanta or in Hall County. Reading between the lines, it's obvious that the sheriff of Forsyth County wanted to appease the bloodthirsty mob with the arrest and imprisonment of Rob Edwards in a jail that was much less secure. He turned the keys over to the local jailer, and the sheriff quickly skipped town while a mob of thousands of people broke in. They say they broke in, but it might as well have been they walked in through the front doors, because there was no scuffle as they beat him to death with a crowbar, filled his body with hundreds of bullets, and hanged Rob Edwards from a local telephone pole in the county square. What followed in early October was the trial of Knox and Daniel and 11 white farmers. One night watchman quickly sentenced them both to death. This sentence was carried out in the court square the following day from sentencing. Officially, public executions had been outlawed in the state of Georgia for years, but a gallows was built with a fence in the courthouse square that was so short it was impossible to not see the double hanging. And in a county of 12,000, 8,000 reportedly showed up to watch as this happened, while so-called night riders amassed on the border with Cherokee County. And the speed and efficiency with which these night riders totally depopulated the black residents of this county, it says something to the fact that they were professionally organized, and the black community of Oscarville lies under these waves. The existence of Oscarville was pretty much covered up by Lake Lanier, but you can still find literal fragments of it in the creek beds around here. We're back again at the Stony Point Baptist Church Cemetery behind these multi-million-dollar mansions north of Atlanta to talk some more, or rather just to show the graves of all that remains of Forsyth County's black population, which for decades and decades, up until the 80s and 90s, was totally gone from this county. And if anybody knows any other sites that would reflect some black history here in the county, please feel free to let me know in the comments. The opening salvo of the 1912 Forsyth County Race Massacre was the lynching of Rob Edwards. Now, Rob Edwards' girlfriend was brother-in-law to Ernest Knox, a 16-year-old black man from Oscarville, who the sheriff had tortured into admitting he'd murdered 19-year-old white girl May Crow. Eventually, he was mock-lynched and forced to name names of other people who he brought back to view the body. The first was his own brother-in-law, Oscar Daniel, and those two boys were brought down to Atlanta for their own protection because they wanted to legally murder them via gallows. But because Rob Edwards was in the local area, they took him to jail as well, and a mob of 2,000 people stripped him naked, beat him to death with a crowbar, filled his body with bullets, and hanged him from the courthouse square. Only a few weeks later, both of the boys, aged 16 and 17, would be hanged in the same square that Rob Edwards was lynched. Clara, it's difficult to make these names out. N.A. Naylor, Clara Naylor. And this is Florida, wife of A.R. Brown, born September 27th, 1873, died February 17th, 1900. And naturally, many of these are just field stones that have been uprooted. Wow, a very early birth, 1828 it looks like. Anderson Strickland. This is the grave of James Harvey Watson, who died very young. He was born 1885 and died in, it looks like 1907. And to the top is a monument that says, "To my son." Always very sad when sons die before their fathers. And these are some more well-preserved graves. You've got Olivia Strickland, died 1897. Benjamin Clement, he had a very early birth in 1823. This one's a little harder to make out. It's Clement, but I can't read the first name. And then over here, Atward Clement, who lived to only be a year old. And here's the grave of another Naylor. This one looks like Georgia nailer. Again, it looks like the night riders came through here and broke many of the tombstones. And this is the fence line of the Stony Point Baptist Church Cemetery. There was a small church that was dynamited here. It's hard to see any remnants of it. It might be under that fire pit, or it might be sort of demarked by some of these stones. It was much smaller than the houses that are now standing in its place. Now, I mentioned the 1906 massacre in Atlanta almost in passing, and I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on that by mentioning the personal note of Dr. Ansel Strickland, who was very well respected here in Forsyth County. At the time of the massacre, he was in the city, and he noted that he saw hundreds of black men, women, and children massacred and totally covered up. This was an event which shook the city of Atlanta, and it all had to do, oddly enough, with a book and a play. What really upset a lot of people, because the social norms in the Deep South were to protect and really just isolate white women, was the inclusion of a plot point in which a white woman is raped by a black man, and the Klan forms to go and murder that soldier after giving him what they viewed as a fair trial. These night riders viewed themselves as vigilante bringers of citizen justice. Now, all that's a very long-winded way of saying that in late 1912, conditions here were primed for a massacre. The traditional agrarian economy of places like Forsyth County had been totally destroyed, and an influx of poor farmers, white and black, were coming to segregated communities like this. Then you also had massacres which took place in Atlanta, which was fresh in everybody's mind, but specifically with the ideas that Southerners had about protecting the beauty of dainty white women at all costs. You had a 24-year-old girl, Grice, who had her home broken into on September 5th, and the men responsible, at least in the eyes of the locals, were released. And only days later, the murder of 19-year-old May Crow, the daughter of a very well-known and respected local family. Locals were naturally out for blood, and in my mind, it's fairly obvious that the massacre was partly coordinated with local authorities. It's not easy to find information about the days immediately preceding the race massacre of 1912, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the break-in of the Grice home, as well as the involvement of Sheriff Bill Reed. I'm not 100% positive this is his grave, but I feel like the dates match up. So 24-year-old Grice reports to the sheriff's department that her home was broken into and she woke up with a black man standing over her bed. It took a day or two for Sheriff Bill Reed to show up, but he immediately arrested a black man, Tony Howell, as the main suspect. He also brought in Tony's 4 friends, Johnny Bates, Fate Chester, Isaiah Perkle, and Joe Rogers. These 5 men were brought to the low-security jail in Cumming, the courthouse square. Now, pretty immediately they were released because there was no evidence tying them to the crime, and Grice sort of didn't want to be involved with the incident. But locals were pretty upset because they wanted swift and brutal justice, so somebody, probably just blowing off steam, I don't believe that the Reverend actually said this, said he overheard a black Reverend, Grant Smith, calling Grice a sorry white woman. Immediately, a white lynch mob had formed, and they went and snatched him from his church and began horsewhipping him. Police descended on that scene and prevented it from becoming a murder, eventually spiriting Reverend Smith over to the courthouse and out of the county entirely. By that point, white men were patrolling the streets of Cumming with guns, and the governor had the fear of God in his heart because he knew a race massacre had happened in Atlanta only a few years prior. That's when he decided to deploy 23 National Guardsmen to prevent any further unrest. To his credit, it really did seem like Sheriff Bill Reed was trying to prevent the lynching of the 5 men held in the courthouse square on the charges of robbery of the Grice home. First, he moved them to a jail in Marietta that was a bit better protected, and then as conditions quickly deteriorated, he moved them to Cobb County. Then, even though Howell had confessed to the burglary, he allowed them to go home, but by that time, conditions in Forsyth were a full-scale racial conflict. Now, she woke up only 3 days before the murder of May Crow, with 2 black men standing over her bed. It was late at night, and she let out a surprised yelp, and the black men both immediately bolted. Through context, it seems like they were just there for a burglary, so when she called the sheriff, he took a few days to show up and arrest them. However, by the time these men were led to the jail next to the courthouse, racial tensions had inflamed because the news of the murder of May Crow had spread. It's important to point out that Ellen Grice, just like May Crow, had no direct role, through her own will at least, of inflaming racial tensions, and she was just a passive bystander. In fact, her story went untold until the mid-1980s, when people started talking about the Forsyth County massacres once more. And we're here at the Island Ford Baptist Church to look for a few graves that have been moved, relocated in the 1950s at the opening of the dam that created Lake Lanier. And here is an African section that was used for enslaved peoples. There's this common idea you'll find online very often that Lake Lanier was created as a way to drown out Oscarville and all its memories, so white people could reap the benefits of racially cleansing the county, but not necessarily leave anything for future generations to know what they had done. And every time they drain the lake, they're able to dig up a few bodies and bury them in nearby churches like this one, the Island Ford Baptist Church. The creation of Lake Lanier drowned out at least 20 family cemeteries. And at that time, in 1912, the price of cotton was plummeting, and there was a severe economic recession in Georgia. And there had also been a few race riots in Atlanta that resulted in the death of dozens of black people because of the creation of the play and book The Klansman, which would later become, of course, Birth of a Nation, which resulted in more race wars. One of the main reasons that lynchings were so prevalent here in the state of Georgia is because we had the county unit voting system for a very long period of time, and I feel that this is a factor which is often overlooked in videos like this. Basically, the county unit voting system, which lasted up until the civil rights movement, was a system in which if you won a county, you won a vote, and whoever won the most counties won the election for the governor of Georgia. Now, of course, this was heavily slated towards rural, conservative counties, and these were the counties that were targeted most by economic recession and the failure of the cotton crop. So, of course, when white women were being raped and murdered, and there was a black community nearby, and now they have 2 boys that they just hung, and also an implication, probably made under duress and torture, that those 2 boys gave of their father or stepfather, the entire state of Georgia's rural population is in an uproar, especially after the father wasn't immediately executed. And so, politicians, in order to make a name for themselves, began creating little chapters of the Ku Klux Klan, or just vigilance committees, night riders, to go in and destroy the community of Oscarville, which was done very, very thoroughly. We still don't have a full account of the number of black people who were killed, but some of the accounts at the time read like it was an actual race war. And certainly this county was a sundown town up until, a lot of people say, the 80s, the 90s. It had virtually no black people living here. And this, being so close to Atlanta, naturally raised a lot of eyebrows. This fear, this outrage, and this state of affairs, Forsyth County remaining a sundown town, would last until 1987. And in the years intervening, black boys had even been told they must leave a summer camp or else they would be forcibly removed. There were many incidents of violence, and basically a sundown town in the Deep South, if you don't know, is if you are black and you're out after sundown, you might just disappear, or you would certainly end up in jail, and Community Watch would make sure that got taken care of. And yet in 1987, on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, seeing that this was basically a white ethno-state in the county, Hosea Williams led 75 marchers through downtown. Those 75 marchers were met by over 400 Klansmen waving nooses, shouting the N-word, and saying that they must keep Forsyth County white. Now, this drew the attention of the entire community, the entire state and the country. Even Oprah came down here and filmed interviews with locals who were, as late as the late 1980s, unabashedly and openly racist. And only a couple of years ago did a monument to the lynching get approved. I'm not sure if it's been built yet.